I love the way they use the term rubbish in Great Britain. I honestly really wish we would adopt that over here. Hey everyone, I'm Jack Fossett and welcome to Real Guitar Talk, where I'm tackling some issues that I think seriously pertain to the general guitar world, and I want to discuss them in a way that's a little bit deeper and more nuanced than what I've seen before. And today I want to talk about the conflict and relationship between the idea of playing with feeling versus playing with technique. Why is there a conflict? Why is this something that needs to be discussed, and maybe how does this sort of negatively affect the guitar world in general? First of all, the idea of playing with feeling versus playing with technique actually really affects not only other musicians but others in the art world as a whole. The idea being that you need to have some sort of emotive quality in order for something to have real artistic substance, as opposed to just using mechanical technique, and if it's too mechanical it's kind of lifeless and all. However, you need to have good technique, particularly a good foundation of technique, in order to be expressive or use any sort of emotion in your playing at all. So how do these things relate, and then how does it relate to conflict? First of all, I think we need to define what does it mean to play with feeling. Already, this is going to stump some people. The best definition I can come up with for playing with feeling is playing dynamically in a way that reflects the spirit of the song, where technique is the servant to artistic integrity, which is the master. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that you're playing with attention to the song. You're trying to play something that suits the song in whatever capacity. It doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be the lead that everyone expects. It could be something totally different, like on the Carpenters' Goodbye to Love, which is a beautiful ballad, but then there's this raucous fuzz solo that's just awesome. So it doesn't necessarily mean it needs to be on the beaten path, but it needs to be in regard to the song. You need to place the integrity of the song above the integrity of your ego, essentially. And that you shouldn't be doing stuff just entirely based on technique and what is good technique, what is good music theory, packing too much stuff in. Now, I think that's really where the conflict between feeling and technique comes in. Because I'm sure many of us, I know I certainly do, know musicians who are too hyper focused on music theory, technique, and basically that all of these things are what make music good, or what make a certain player good, or what make a certain part good. And it's not good if it doesn't have some sort of superior or high level technique or music theory. And we can hopefully all generally agree that that's not true, and that that's bad, essentially. That sort of distorts the beautiful humanity that is found in music. The depth that sort of reaches us in our soul is not just down to some mathematical formula. It's something that goes much deeper than that. Again, though, I go back to the fact that you need good technique in order to play with feeling. And there's this sort of like constant relationship and harmony with them, but also a dissonance with them. There's a tension between them, because when do you know that you're playing with feeling versus playing with technique? Because you need to have a certain amount of attention on your technique in order to even play with feeling. Also, playing with feeling can be quantifiable, believe it or not. And I actually put this to the test some years ago. This is something I just kind of did secretly for my own research, so to speak. But I noticed that a lot of young guitar players were playing these sort of very quick bends and slides, where they'll play a quick like half step dissonant slide and then back or note. It's very, very common. I think a lot of it grew out of like the John Mayer camp. It's actually oddly reminiscent of some old saxophone solos that I've heard. And so I started incorporating some of these licks, and I thought, all these young players, a lot of people are saying like, wow, they're so expressive the way that they play. And this was one technique that I really picked up on that a lot of them do. So I thought maybe I'll add that in and see what people say. And when I did, I got comments that, wow, that playing was really expressive. It had a lot of feeling. I can assure you, when I was playing it, it was purely academic. It was purely, I'm going to try this new technique and see what people say. And people said, wow, that has more feeling. I was literally playing with no feeling. I was just regurgitating a lick, essentially. I learned a lick that people said had feeling, and so I plugged it into my playing to see if that would make a difference in the response. So that begs the question, when you play something, does it always have to come directly from the heart? Do you have to have your total passion into it in order for it to be playing with feeling versus playing just mechanically? Now, this is leading into my next point, which is maybe some of us think that certain things just inherently have feeling. A style of play just inherently has feeling. This is where the conversations that we have about what is feeling versus technique and this sort of tension, this is where this gets derailed often. Because too frequently, the discussions that we have over this are completely bogged down by personal preference and just genres that we're into. Now, I'm a blues and rock player primarily. In fact, I'm more of a rock and Americana player with a foot in the blues. I love blues music, but I'm not a straight up blues player, certainly. Those genres speak to me. They have emotion and movements and lyrics that really kind of penetrate your soul, essentially. There's something that grabs you. And this is where I want to talk about music being like a language. This was something that a great guitar player that I know named Mark Leonard, who's a jazz rocker, he said music is a language, and he was talking about it in reference to jazz. And so I want to mention jazz, because I know a lot of people who are playing blues and rock. You might think of jazz players as some of these bad ones, right? Talking about how it has to have a certain amount of technique or theory in order to be good. And I've played with jazz musicians who are exactly like that, like the stereotype. Now, bear in mind that jazz generally has more intricate movements which are going to dictate how you can play, what you can do, as opposed to something like blues, which is more of an open canvas for expression. Does that mean that you can't be expressive, that you can't play with feeling in jazz because there's sort of a higher level of requirement of music theory and technique in order to even play it to the level that you need to be able to play it? I don't think so. I think many of us just essentially don't speak that language, particularly when you're talking about modern jazz. You know, if you're talking about older jazz that has a little bit more of a standard melodic content that reaches more people, that might be a different thing. But modern jazz, which is a bit more abstract. Now, I want to bring up one of my surprisingly favorite guitar players. This might surprise some of you, but someone I love is John Scofield. Now, when I first started listening to John Scofield, I was listening to a tribute album he did of all Ray Charles music. And he had a great all-star cast with him, different guests on different songs. And I just loved it. His playing was really jazzy, but it was something I could kind of like, I could conceptualize, I could grab hold of it. I loved that album so much, I got another one of his albums called Piety Street, where he plays gospel tunes, and I just thought, this is great. I was so great to hear all this is like the melody, like good movements that I could relate to. They had a complexity to them that wasn't what I had been listening to at the time, so I felt like I was growing as a musician listening to it, and it was just wonderful. So then I tried one of his older albums, which was more modern jazz, and I just didn't get it. Now, his playing was his playing. It was his voice, it was his style. You know, certainly we all kind of grow and develop and do different things, but his playing was John Scofield's playing. I just didn't relate to it. That doesn't mean he wasn't playing with any less feeling than he would have been playing Ray Charles music, playing old gospel tunes. It just means that I'm not speaking that same language. I could still hear his voice in a weird way. It would almost be like if you don't speak French and you listen to someone say a poem that you've never heard in French, you recognize their voice, you recognize their inflection, but you just don't know what they're saying. That was kind of my experience with that, and that was what started to get me to think about, like, you know, hey, maybe these players do play with feeling, but we just don't get it. I had this experience recently at a classical music concert too. We took my kids to see Bach on the mighty Koczmar organ in Portland, Maine. Everyone should check that out. It's one of only 2 city municipal organs in the country. This isn't sponsored or anything. I just want to share it with you all. The organist was a guy named James Kennerly. Really, absolutely fantastic organ player. And he played a whole night of Bach. And I'll be straight up when I say I don't really get Bach. Bach to me it has a mathematical sophistication to it that seems to be the basis of it. Now, when James would stop and we played a piece and then he would talk to the audience about it, at one point he said, he described all these emotions that were from it, and it was surprising here, and it was spooky here, and it was this here, and it was that there. And I sat there thinking, like, I literally did not get any of that from it. Now, I do connect with someone like Mozart or Beethoven or Tchaikovsky. Their style I more get. Would anyone dare to say that people who play Bach don't play with passion, or that he didn't write with passion or feeling? Or do you just not speak that language, like the situation with me was? Now, if you don't speak a language and someone else hails it as brilliant, this is where the conversation derails even further and takes a good concept of playing with feeling, playing with heart, and turns it into something negative. This is where the pedal really hits the metal, so to speak. A lot of times, we then fall back on playing with feeling as a cliche or platitude to boost ourselves in a sort of social hierarchy to make up for what we perceive as an inadequacy, as something that makes us less than another musician. That, oh, well, their taste seems more sophisticated than mine. Well, it's just because I like stuff that's played with feeling. I like feeling. That stuff, sure, yeah, maybe it's complex, but my stuff has more heart to it. And this is where you really start to see a nasty divide, and this has a number of bad consequences. First of all, it's pointless. It's essentially kind of pathetic, too, to have to do this. I wouldn't say that blues players have the patent on playing with feeling. Now, I'm throwing blues players under the bus here. I don't mean to do that. That's kind of the obvious comparison, right? This is what I think a lot of people hear. There's, blues. Well, blues has a lot of feeling. Jazz has a lot of sophistication, has a lot of complexity, but blues has more feeling, and this is something that we've probably all seen a lot. So not all blues players are like this. I want to be very, very clear about that. And not all jazz players are, thumbing their nose down at everyone else. And this is also not limited to just these two genres. I'm just using it as an example. The point is, if you like blues, great. If you like jazz, great. One is not inherently better than the other. I don't like generally ambiguous arguments of, hey, what's good for you is good for you. And I do think that there are some forms of music and some performances of music that are objectively better than others. I do believe that there is such a thing as objective beauty. However, there is so much variance and so much dynamics in all of these things that what speaks to you really should just be okay, and you shouldn't have to sort of bring someone down because you feel like you're perceiving that they're looking down at you, essentially. Now, there's another part to that this is where I think it really also negatively affects the person saying it. If you're pulling down someone else, that just brings down the whole conversation. But within yourself, I've seen a lot of players use playing with feeling as a cliche excuse to not get better. Because you don't need to learn that extra theory, you don't need to learn that extra technique because you play with feeling. Well, playing with good feeling is based on playing with good technique. Real freedom in that sense, real freedom to play expressively can only come once your technique is good enough that you can actually play what you hear in your head, and your fingers automatically go there because they know where it is. And I know a lot of players who talk about how great it is to just play with feeling who haven't reached that point yet because they use it as an excuse to not get better. And I hate seeing that. I hate seeing people essentially not want to grow because they're resting on their laurels and using a cliche as this sort of like shield from anything that could be challenging or difficult. Because playing with feeling can be this ultimate sort of like, but it could be anything. It's sort of like chaos versus order, right? Order, good technique, well, it's too mechanical, it boxes you in too much, there's too much limiting of what you can do. Playing with feeling, that could be anything. But often, sometimes playing with feeling, if you're just shooting for that and ignoring all this, can just be a whole lot of being lost and not really knowing what to play. Maybe just doing a couple of big bends or regurgitating some licks that you learned once, but then how is that any different than just playing mechanical, but not really using the good technique to then graduate to a higher level? Now, the last thing I want to talk about is how this affects communication about others. This also relates to something I think more serious, which is the decline of communication based on the internet. I know that sounds like an aside, but I promise that they're connected. The very truth of the matter is that you don't know what someone else is feeling when they're playing guitar. And this kind of goes back to the John Scofield thing. Now, there are certainly some artists who can just play in such a way that even if it's a genre you don't listen to, you can somehow still relate to it. That's certainly a thing, so this isn't a blanket rule necessarily, but you don't know what someone's feeling. You don't know why they're playing what they play, what their drive for music is. You know, some people have a genuine love and passion for good technique and for good music theory. And I think of somebody like Robin Ford, right? He's got great technique. He's got great amounts of theory and all kinds of things packed into his solos. And yet he plays, at least the way I perceive it, he plays with such passion. He plays with such voice. And clearly he has a love for that style of music, or else he wouldn't play it. Some people love that mathematical sophistication of Bach, and I wouldn't put them down for it. Also, within ourselves, it's a struggle to sometimes play with feeling versus playing with technique. As I mentioned, sometimes when I have played very, very academically, just tried out new things, people have said, hey, you're playing really expressively. Other times I thought I was really like pouring heart and soul into it, and people said like, ah, it's just kind of mindless, mindless shredding or whatever. And there's a notable guitar player that I had a conversation with another guitarist about this notable guitar player, and he said he likes this guy's playing. He thinks there's so much feeling in his playing. There's so much passion in his playing. I happen to like his songwriting and his voice, but I personally think his playing sounds kind of dead and mechanical. So this other guitar player thought that this guy's playing was incredibly passionate with a lot of feeling, and I don't get that. So how does this relate to internet communication and kind of the decline of internet communication? Well, this is how. We had that conversation in person. We were exploring ideas together, talking about likes and dislikes, and kind of maybe making sense of the world by exploring these ideas. But nowadays you have things like Facebook groups and internet forums. And those are places where you have a published word. And I know it doesn't seem like that because of the sheer ridiculous amount of posts that are out there nowadays. But when you publish something like that, when you put out to the world, hey, I don't like this guy. I don't think he plays with any feeling. Now I've directly played into that. It's that same social hierarchy thing. I'm trying to elevate myself by tearing someone else down. I've now done it in a printed way where the world can see, where it will presumably never come down unless I delete it. And that person could potentially see it, particularly nowadays. Particularly nowadays where there are a lot of famous guitar players who are active on social media. These things can actually come back and negatively affect another person when it's really just me trying to make sense of my likes and dislikes, and again, on the negative side, trying to boost myself up by tearing someone else down. Now, I don't think I'm going to stop negative internet communication with my video here, right? That would be like me standing at the bottom of a hill with a giant boulder rolling towards me being like, I got it, don't worry, I got it. Obviously that's ridiculous, but hopefully somebody's watching this video who might have had a proclivity to do negative posts like that, and maybe gives you a chance to think twice about, hey, maybe that's a conversation better left to in person, where it sort of dissipates and all that you're left with is the ideas and the connection that you had with the person you were speaking with. That's a healthy form of communication. In that setting, you can say, oh, geez, this person's terrible. He's a hack. I don't know how that person got famous. But don't post that. Have these conversations in person. And I go back to that whole point of you don't know what someone's feeling. And sometimes we're not all playing with feeling. Sometimes if we're struggling, we rest back on our technique just to get through a song. Other times we feel like we're just like in tune with the spirit of music in the universe and nothing we can play is bad, right? The ebbs and flows like that as a guitar player are incredible. I would even say there's another side to it, which is there are contexts of different types of playing. And for this one, I want to talk about one of my other favorites, Eric Clapton. I've noticed with Eric Clapton, when he's playing and there are no other big name guitar players kind of up sharing the bill with him, He plays a little more in tune with the song. He seems to have a little bit more regard for just the song, what would structure a good solo, what would really enhance the music and bring the music to the next level. When he's playing in these big groups, like he's done a lot over the past decade or so, there's more of a sporty side to him, right? Like if he's playing the Crossroads Festival or whatever else he's doing, there's more of this trading licks. It's like a musical sparring, so to speak. It's not necessarily that you're trying to beat the other person, but you're trying to elevate each other. You're trying to show like, yeah, well, I got this to bring to the table. Now show me what you got. And you're kind of trying to you are trying to top each other a little bit in a way, in a certainly a hopefully a healthy sportsmanlike way. Some people love that. Some people love that, like, oh, and the licks they came out with were just fantastic because they keep kind of trying to one up each other. I personally prefer the other style. I never thought Clapton sounded better than the 2005 Cream reunion or some of the other stuff he did around that era when it was really kind of like, he certainly had some other guitar players playing with him at different times, but he was the guy. I prefer that. Some people prefer this. Which one of us is right? Neither of us is right. In which case does he have more feeling? I would argue that he has more feeling when it's kind of just him. But does that mean that all this is just mechanical nonsense? No. So, the point to having this talk is to sort of rethink using the idea of playing with feeling as a cliche, specifically to tear other players down, to lift yourself up in a social hierarchy, and to use as a blanket statement to absolve you of needing to learn music. Don't do those things. We should strive for a better guitar world with healthier communication. That's my point on this topic. I would love to hear what all of your points are. Please let us know in the comments. I'm Jack Fossett, and we'll see you next time.